The wedding of the year for the city's elite is interrupted by a woman who, until now, has been invisible. She carries a manila folder, and inside it, decades of abuse, lies, and broken silence. Standing before the altar, she reveals documents that tear away the family's veneer of perfection, and with a single sentence, she dismantles an empire built on pain and manipulation. If this story grabs you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now we continue. The New York City morning awoke with that characteristic weekday rush when the city seemed to have no time to even breathe. Traffic was already building on the major avenues, and the sound of honking horns echoed like an urban symphony everyone knew by heart. But inside the penthouse on the Upper East Side, the silence was almost awkward. Helen watched from her bedroom window as the skyscrapers rose in the distance, each one representing someone else's dreams, lives that were moving forward while hers seemed frozen in time. She had just turned 53 the week before, a milestone that passed almost unnoticed, marked only by a formal dinner where Richard, her husband, had made a quick toast before turning back to talk business with their guests. Helen didn't even mind. She was used to being a detail in her own life, a decorative figure in the home she had helped build over the years of their marriage. 28 years beside a man who treated her like part of the inventory, something that was there because it had always been, but could be replaced if necessary. Richard Anderson was the kind of man New York high society admired, a successful real estate developer, owner of a firm that erected skyscrapers all over the city, always with that calculated smile and firm handshake that closed multi-million-dollar deals. To outsiders, he was the perfect husband, the exemplary provider. But Helen knew the other side of that coin. She knew the man who came home and dripped poison with words carefully chosen to wound, without leaving visible marks. She knew the look of contempt when she dared to have an opinion of her own. She knew the icy silence that lasted for days when she didn't behave exactly as he expected. Richard's first marriage had ended more than a decade ago. Helen was still married to him when Brenda appeared in her husband's life, the executive assistant as he liked to introduce her, young, ambitious, with that air of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and would stop at nothing to get it. Helen remembered the day Richard came home and, without beating around the bush, said he wanted a divorce. There was no drama, no pleading. She just nodded, too tired to fight for something that had been dead for years. But the divorce never actually happened. Richard discovered that a formal separation would hurt his business, affecting important contracts where the image of a family man weighed heavily on decisions, so he changed his tune. He said they had to think of the children, that a separation would be traumatic for Ethan and Leo. Helen, as always, gave in. She stayed in the house, kept up appearances, and became an even more discreet shadow. And Brenda? Brenda found her place in that distorted structure. She became Richard's official companion, the one who accompanied him to social events while Helen stayed home. Over time, Brenda practically moved into the penthouse, occupying one of the rooms in the West Wing, moving through the house as if she were the true lady of the manor. And Helen allowed it. She always allowed it. It was easier that way. The children grew up in that toxic environment. Leo, the eldest, was 32, and the very picture of what Helen had always dreamed a man could be. Kind, respectful, hard-working. He had distanced himself from his father after a violent argument about the direction of the company and now ran his own architecture firm in Soho. Leo was different. He had his father's eyes, but his heart hadn't yet been corrupted by greed. Ethan, on the other hand, was the son Richard had molded in his own image. At 29, he already mirrored all of his father's behaviors. The arrogance, the veiled contempt for anyone he considered inferior, the subtle manipulation that bent people to his will. Helen looked at Ethan and felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't just pain, it was a deep guilt for not having been able to protect him from becoming that. Ethan's wedding was scheduled for 3 days from now. The bride was Julia, a 26-year-old young woman whom Helen had only met twice. A pretty girl with a shy smile, and a look that seemed to carry an invisible weight. There was something about her that bothered Helen, a disguised sadness she recognized all too well. It was the same kind of sadness she saw in the mirror every morning. The first time Julia visited the penthouse, Helen noticed how she shrank near Ethan, how her shoulders slumped slightly whenever he spoke. It was like watching a younger version of herself, and it deeply disturbed her. She tried to talk to the girl, offer her coffee, create some connection. But Ethan always interrupted, always controlled the flow of the conversation, always decided when it was time to leave. On the second visit, Helen got the impression that Julia wanted to tell her something. They were alone in the kitchen for a few minutes while Ethan took a call in the living room. Julia opened her mouth as if to speak, but then Ethan returned and the moment was lost. Helen saw the fear in the girl's eyes, a fear she knew intimately. Now, 3 days before the wedding, Helen was sitting on the penthouse terrace, having her breakfast alone. Richard had already left for a meeting. Brenda was still asleep. And the children no longer lived there. The enormous house seemed to echo the emptiness of her existence. She picked up her phone and scrolled idly through social media, looking at the photos people shared of their seemingly perfect lives. Wide smiles, united families, moments of happiness frozen in filters that beautified reality. It was then that she saw a post from Ethan. A photo of him and Julia at a chic restaurant, she in a navy blue dress. He with that smile Helen knew so well, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. The caption said something about true love and the countdown to the big day. But when Helen looked more closely at the image, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Julia's eyes weren't smiling. There was an almost imperceptible tension at the corner of her mouth, in her slightly tensed shoulders, in the hand that gripped the wine glass with excessive force. Helen zoomed in on the photo. She studied every detail, and then she saw it, reflected in the glass of the window behind the couple, something that shouldn't have been there. A car. A red car parked across the street, partially visible. Something about that car bothered her, but she couldn't identify what. She saved the image to her phone more out of instinct than reason. The day followed its slow course. Helen had lunch alone, then went to the salon to get her nails done for the wedding. The manicurist, a friendly older woman named Rosie, who had been doing her nails for years, chatted excitedly about the ceremony. "Your son is getting married at St. Ignatius Loyola, isn't he, Mrs. Anderson? What a beautiful church. Everything must be so lavishly prepared." Helen just smiled and nodded. Rosie went on talking, about weddings she had seen, about wedding dresses, about grand parties. Helen listened without really hearing, her mind still stuck on that photo, on that car reflected in the glass, on Julia's look that was silently screaming for help. When she returned home, it was late afternoon. The apartment was empty again. Helen headed to her room, but as she passed down the hall, she heard voices coming from Richard's office. The door was slightly ajar. She recognized her husband's voice and Ethan's. They were arguing about something, and the tone was tense. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something made her stop. She stood in the hallway, her heart racing, feeling like a stranger in her own home. "We can't risk anything now." Richard's voice was low but firm. "It's 3 days away. After you're married, everything solidifies. The company, the shares, everything." "I know that, Dad. It's all under control." "She can't back out." "Are you sure she won't do anything stupid?" "I'm sure. She knows what's at stake." "And your brother? Does he still not know anything?" "Leo is completely in the dark. He has no idea." Helen felt the floor give way beneath her. What were they talking about? What was this secret? Why couldn't Leo know? And why that threatening tone when Ethan spoke about Julia? Good. Keep it that way. After the wedding, his stake in the company automatically decreases according to the new contract. He signed it without even reading it properly. "It was too easy," Ethan laughed, a humorless sound. "He trusts me." Naivety has its price. Helen carefully backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She went back to her room and closed the door, leaning against it as if she needed support to keep from falling. Her hands were shaking. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't even know existed. Ethan was manipulating Leo in some way. There was something about the wedding that would benefit the family business. And Julia, that girl with the sad eyes, was at the center of it all. But how? Why? Helen sat on the bed and tried to take a deep breath. For so many years she had trained herself not to see, not to question, to just exist on the surface of things. It was safer that way, easier. But now something inside her was waking up. Her voice she had silenced for decades was beginning to whisper that maybe it was time to see, to question, to act. She picked up her phone again and looked at the picture of Ethan and Julia. She zoomed in on the reflection of the red car in the glass. There was something written on the side, but it was too blurry to read. She tried using her phone's editing tools to increase the contrast, to brighten the image. Nothing worked. Then Helen did something she hadn't done in a long time. She made a decision. The next day, she woke up early and left the house before Richard or Brenda came down for breakfast. She took her car, a silver sedan she rarely used, and drove to Soho. She parked across from the building where Leo's office was located and waited. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say to her son, but she needed to see him, needed to understand what was happening. Leo arrived around 9 o'clock. He walked down the sidewalk with that easygoing manner he always had, a brown leather messenger bag over his shoulder, earbuds in his ears. Helen got out of the car and called his name. He turned, surprised to see her there. "Mom, is everything okay? Did something happen?" "Can we talk?" "Of course. Let's go up." Leo's office was small but welcoming, with plants in the windows and architectural plans spread across the tables. There were only 2 other employees who greeted Helen politely before returning to their work. Leo led her to his private office and offered her coffee. They sat across from each other, and for a long moment, Helen didn't know how to begin. Leo waited patiently with that kind look that always made her feel like there was still goodness in the world. "Are you okay, Mom? You look tired." "I'm fine, honey. It's just, I've been thinking a lot about your brother's wedding." "Ethan's wedding?" Leo's face tightened slightly. "What about it? Do you know Julia?" There was a pause. Leo looked out the window and Helen saw something flash in his eyes. Pain. A deep, recent pain. "I used to," he said finally. "But that was a long time ago." "You dated?" "Why are you asking this, Mom?" "I just want to understand, please." Leo sighed, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture of exhaustion. "Yes, we dated for almost 2 years. We broke up 6 months ago. And then she started dating Ethan." "Yeah, apparently." Helen watched her son carefully. There was more to it, she was sure. "You still love her, don't you?" Leo didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with restrained emotion. "What I feel doesn't matter anymore, Mom. She made her choice." "Are you sure about that?" "What do you mean?" "Are you sure she was the one who chose?" Leo stared at her, confused. "Mom, what's going on? Why? All these questions?" Helen felt the words get stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to explain her suspicions without sounding crazy, without sounding like a bitter woman inventing theories about her own son. So she chose another path. "Tell me about Julia. How did you 2 meet?" And Leo told her. He talked about the day he first saw her at an art exhibit at the Met, how she was standing in front of a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, completely absorbed, how he approached her, and they started talking about colors and shapes, and that conversation stretched on for hours. How they discovered they lived in the same neighborhood, went to the same coffee shop on Sundays, had mutual friends, but had never crossed paths before. She was special, Mom. Smart, funny, sensitive. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, loved to travel, dreamed of seeing Europe. We'd spend hours talking about everything. It was easy to be with her. And what happened? Leo was quiet for a moment, as if reliving something painful. She started to pull away, said she needed space, that she was confused. I tried to understand, gave her the time she asked for, and then one day she just ended it, said she'd fallen for someone else. She wouldn't give me details, just said I deserved someone better. 2 weeks later, Ethan called me saying he was dating someone, that he'd met this incredible girl and was in love. When he sent me a picture of her, I almost fell out of my chair. Did you confront him? I did. He said he didn't know I had dated her, that it was just a coincidence, that New York is a small town for certain coincidences. I didn't believe him, but what could I do? She had made her choice. What if it wasn't a choice? Leo frowned. What are you talking about, Mom? Helen took a deep breath. She knew she was about to open a door she couldn't close again. What if she was forced in some way? What if there's something you don't know? That doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone force her to break up with me and get with Ethan? I don't know, honey. But yesterday, I overheard a conversation between your father and your brother. They were talking about you, about the wedding, about how you couldn't know something. It sounded like a conspiracy. Leo stood up, visibly agitated. Mom, are you okay? You're not imagining things, are you? The words hurt, but Helen understood. She would have doubted it herself if she were in his shoes. After all, she was the woman who had always accepted everything silently, who never questioned, who was always considered fragile and submissive. Why would he believe her now? Maybe I am, she said calmly, standing up as well. But what if I'm not? What if there's something very wrong happening and we're all seeing it but no one is really looking? Leo hugged her, a gesture that was affectionate but condescending. Mum, Ethan can be a lot of things, but I don't think he'd go that far. And Julia, she's a grown woman, capable of making her own decisions. Sometimes things just don't work out and we have to accept it. Helen nodded, but inside something was screaming that she needed to prove what she felt. She needed to find concrete evidence. She said goodbye to Leo and went back to her car. Sitting behind the wheel, she looked at the photo on her phone again. The reflection of the red car. She had to find out what it meant, if it meant anything at all. She spent the rest of the day researching. She joined social media groups, searched for Julia's pages, tried to find old photos of her with Leo. She found a few. In them, Julia was visibly different. She smiled with her eyes. Her body was relaxed. There was a lightness about her that no longer existed. The transformation was obvious. That night, during dinner, Helen watched Richard and Brenda discuss the final wedding preparations. Brenda was particularly excited, talking about the dress she would wear, the important guests who would be there, how the wedding would elevate the family's status. And you, Helen? Richard turned to her suddenly. Are you excited for your son's wedding? Of course, she replied automatically. You don't seem like it. You've been acting strange the last few days. Just tired. Brenda let out a low laugh. Tired from what exactly? You don't do a thing all day. The sentence hung in the air like a sharp blade. Helen felt the old pain, the old humiliation. But this time something different happened. Instead of shrinking, of lowering her head and accepting the insult in silence, she looked directly at Brenda. You're right, Brenda, I don't do anything. For years I've done nothing but watch and swallow. But you know what people who watch in silence get to see? A lot of things. Things that people who are too busy talking end up missing. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard looked surprised, almost shocked. Brenda opened her mouth, but said nothing. And Helen, for the first time in decades, felt something she had forgotten existed inside her. Power. Not the power to dominate or control, but the power to exist fully, to take up her space, to have a voice. She finished her dinner in silence and went to her room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind buzzing. She knew she had started something she could no longer stop. She had broken the silence subtly, but enough to show that she was no longer the same. The next day, with only 2 days until the wedding, Helen woke up with a plan. She needed concrete proof. She needed to understand what was happening, and she knew exactly where to start. She waited for Richard to leave for work and Brenda to go to the spa. When she was sure she was alone, she went into her husband's office. Her fingers trembled as she went through the files, the documents, searching for anything that could confirm her suspicions. She found contracts, papers about the company, but nothing that made immediate sense. Then, in a locked drawer that she managed to open with a paperclip, she found a folder. Inside, there were documents about the company's restructuring, new divisions of stock ownership, and there in small but clear print was Leo's name with a significantly smaller percentage than he had always had. The date of the change coincided exactly with the period when he had signed the new contracts Richard had mentioned in his conversation with Ethan. Helen photographed everything with her phone. She kept looking. In another folder, she found receipts from an auto body shop, high amounts, repairs to a car. But what caught her attention was the name on the receipt. It wasn't anyone from the family. It was an unknown, generic name. She photographed that too. She was about to close the drawer when she saw at the back a flash drive. She hesitated. She knew she was invading her husband's privacy, that this could have consequences. But the voice inside her that had awakened wouldn't let her back down now. She took the flash drive and went to her room. She plugged it into her personal laptop and waited. There was only one folder on it, named with a date from 6 months ago. She opened it. What she saw left her breathless. They were security camera videos, multiple angles of a street in the East Village. In one of the videos, she clearly saw a red car speeding out of a narrow alley. And then the impact. The car hit someone crossing the street, a woman. She fell to the ground. The car stopped for a few seconds, but then sped off and fled. Helen paused the video and zoomed in. She could see the car's license plate. She wrote down the numbers. She went back to watching. The woman on the ground was getting up slowly with difficulty. The camera didn't show her face clearly, but it showed enough. Helen recognized the coat, recognized the purse. It was her. Helen had to clutch her chest, feeling her heart race. That accident. She remembered it vaguely. It had been 6 months ago on a rainy day. She was coming back from a doctor's appointment when she was hit. She fell, hit her head, was dazed. Some people came to help, called an ambulance. She spent the night in the hospital for observation, had a mild concussion, some bruises. Richard hadn't even visited her, just sent a driver to pick her up the next day. At the time, she told the police she hadn't seen the car, that it all happened too fast. And it was true, she hadn't seen it, but someone had. Someone had these images, and that someone was her husband. She went back to the flash drive and opened the other files. There were screenshots of conversations, messages between Ethan and someone whose name was saved only as Jay. The messages were clear. Ethan knew about the accident. He knew who had hit Helen, and he was using it to blackmail the person. The last messages were from a week before the engagement announcement. Ethan wrote, "You have 2 options. You agree to marry me, and I make these videos disappear, or I turn everything over to the police, and you face charges for a hit and run. You could even go to jail. Your whole family will find out, and so will my brother." Jay's reply was, "You can't do this to me." Ethan, "I can, and I will. The choice is yours." More messages. Jay trying to negotiate, trying to explain, trying to ask for more time. Ethan, inflexible, pressuring, increasingly threatening. And then, finally, the surrender. "Okay, I accept." Helen closed the laptop, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Now it all made sense. Julia had hit her without knowing who she was. She had fled in a panic. Ethan found out somehow, got the videos, and used it to blackmail the girl into breaking up with Leo and marrying him. And Richard knew everything. He probably even helped get the footage, used his contacts, his resources, all of it to manipulate Leo, to reduce his stake in the company, to concentrate power in the hands of Ethan and consequently in the hands of Richard. Helen felt nauseous. She ran to the bathroom and threw up. She knelt on the cold floor, her forehead resting on the porcelain, trying to process the magnitude of it all. Her family, or what was left of it, was even more rotten than she had imagined. And she herself, without knowing it, was a central piece in that cruel manipulation. Julia was being forced to marry a man she didn't love, sacrificing her happiness and Leo's, all for fear of going to jail, of destroying her life, her family. And no one knew, no one except the monsters who orchestrated it. Helen got up slowly, washed her face, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was no longer the same one who had woken up that morning. There was a new determination in her eyes, a strength she thought she had lost decades ago. She spent the rest of the day copying all the files from the flash drive, organizing the evidence, printing documents. She created a black leather briefcase where she meticulously stored everything. Every photo, every video, every message, every receipt, every contract. Everything that proved the blackmail, the manipulation, the years of psychological abuse she herself had suffered, and that was now being repeated with another innocent woman. That night, when Richard came home and asked how her day had been, Helen replied with a calm smile that Everything was fine, that she was resting for the big day. He seemed satisfied and asked no more questions, but Helen didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, the leather briefcase beside her, thinking about what she would do. She knew she had only one chance to do this right, only one moment when she would have everyone's attention, when she could expose the truth in a way that no one could ignore or cover up. The wedding, the ceremony, the altar. There was only one day left. The morning of the day before the wedding arrived with a sky heavy with grey clouds over New York City. Helen woke before dawn, after a night where sleep was only an occasional visitor. The black leather briefcase sat on her dresser, and she looked at it for long minutes, as if that ordinary-looking object could give her all the answers she was still seeking. She knew that what she was about to do would change everything. There would be no turning back. It would be the end of her marriage, the end of the family as everyone knew it, the end of the public image Richard so carefully guarded. But it would also be, she hoped, the beginning of something new. Julia's liberation, Leo's reconciliation with the woman he loved, and maybe, just maybe, her own redemption. She got up and made coffee. The penthouse was still silent, everyone asleep. Helen liked these quiet morning hours, when she could pretend she was the only person in the world, that there were no dramas, manipulations, or pains waiting for her on the other side of her bedroom door. She sat at the kitchen table with the warm cup between her hands and thought about how everything had come to this. 28 years of marriage, 28 years of accepting the unacceptable, normalizing abuse, convincing herself that this was the price to pay for financial security, for a roof over her head, for her children. But did the children really benefit? Leo had grown up sensitive and good despite his father, not because of him, and Ethan had become a replica of the worst Richard had to offer. Where had she gone wrong? At what point did she allow everything to fall apart like this? Helen knew she didn't have all the answers, but she knew that now, for the first time in decades, she had a chance to do something right, something that mattered. Around 8 in the morning, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan in a family group chat that included her, Richard, and Leo. The message said the church rehearsal would be at 3 in the afternoon and that everyone's presence was mandatory. Leo replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Richard didn't even bother to respond, and Helen, after hesitating, typed, "I'll be there." The rehearsal. It would be her chance to see Julia again, to perhaps manage to speak with her in private, to confirm what she already knew in her heart. She needed to look that girl in the eyes and be absolutely sure before she did what she planned to do. She spent the morning getting ready. She chose a simple but elegant outfit, a navy blue dress she rarely wore. She made sure to apply her makeup carefully, to style her hair, to look in the mirror and see not a victim, but a woman about to take control of her own story. When she went down to the living room, she found Brenda having breakfast and flipping through a design magazine. She looked up and scanned Helen from head to toe with that critical gaze she always had. "Going out?" "I'm going to the wedding rehearsal." "Oh, is that today?" Brenda turned her attention back to the magazine. Richard didn't say anything. "He knows. It's in the family group chat." Brenda shrugged, uninterested. Helen felt the old anger rise, but she took a deep breath and swallowed it. It wasn't worth wasting energy on this woman now. She had bigger battles ahead. She grabbed her purse and the black leather briefcase. She placed the briefcase inside a discreet tote bag and left the apartment, without another word. In the elevator, she hugged the bag to her chest, as if it were the most precious thing she owned. And, in a way, it was. She arrived at St. Ignatius Loyola half an hour early. The church was imposing, with its colourful stained glass windows and architecture that blended modern elements with the classic. Helen entered slowly, feeling the weight of the sacred silence of the place. There were a few people already there, probably from the event planning team, adjusting flowers and chairs. She sat in one of the back pews and just watched. The altar was being decorated with immense arrangements of white flowers, everything so perfect, so planned, so artificial, like the life she had led for so long. Gradually, people began to arrive. The priest, a middle-aged man with a kind air, greeted Helen politely. The groomsmen, friends of Ethan's whom she barely knew, arrived in a group, laughing and talking loudly, turning the solemn atmosphere into something more mundane. The wedding planner, a thin woman with large glasses, bustled back and forth with a clipboard, giving orders and checking details. Leo arrived alone, and Helen's heart ached to see her son. He looked different, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his gaze distant. He approached her and sat down beside her. "Hi, Mum." "Hi, honey. How are you?" "I'm fine," he lied, and they both knew it was a lie. Helen took his hand and squeezed it lightly. Leo looked at her, surprised by the show of affection. She rarely did that, rarely stepped outside the bounds of what was expected of her. "Everything's going to be okay," she said softly. "I promise." Leo seemed confused, but he didn't have time to ask anything because at that moment Ethan entered the church, and with him, Julia. Helen felt the air leave her lungs. It was the first time she had seen Julia in person since discovering the whole truth. The girl wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun. She walked beside Ethan, but there was a space between them, an invisible but palpable distance. Ethan had his hand in his pocket, his face relaxed, but Julia's shoulders were tense, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the floor. Leo stiffened beside Helen. She felt his breathing change, become faster, more difficult. He hadn't expected this, wasn't prepared to see the woman he loved there, about to marry his brother. "Do you want to leave?" Helen whispered. "No. I have to do this." "You don't have to." "I have to, Mom. I need to see that it's real, that she really chose him." Helen wanted to say that it hadn't been a choice, wanted to tell him everything right then and there, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. She had to do it the right way, at the right time, with all the proof, with all the witnesses. Ethan saw Leo, and nodded, a gesture too casual to be genuine. Leo didn't return it. Julia didn't look in their direction, keeping her gaze fixed on the altar as if she were hypnotized. The rehearsal began. The planner arranged everyone in their correct places, explained the step-by-step process, corrected postures and positions. Ethan seemed bored, responding in monosyllables, more interested in checking his phone than paying attention. Julia followed all the instructions mechanically, like a jointed doll. At one point, the planner asked them to rehearse the bride's entrance. Julia was to walk in alone, as her parents had passed away years ago, a detail Helen hadn't known, and that saddened her deeply. The girl was completely alone in the world, with no family to protect her, to advise her, to notice what was happening. Julia walked down the center aisle, and Helen watched every step. The rehearsal dress was simple, but even so, she could imagine what it would be like the next day, with the real wedding gown, the veil, the illusion of happiness. But Julia's eyes didn't lie. They were silently screaming for help. When she reached the altar and stood facing Ethan, Helen saw a tear roll down the girl's face. The planner, thinking it was emotion, smiled and commented something about sensitive brides. Ethan didn't seem to notice or didn't care. He just took Julia's hands mechanically, as part of the script. Leo, beside Helen, had his hands clenched into fists. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the pain he was trying to contain. She wanted to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but words seemed inadequate. The rehearsal continued. The exchange of rings, vows, the final kiss, all rehearsed, all planned, all fake. When they finished, the planner clapped her hands in satisfaction and said everything was perfect, that the wedding would be beautiful. People began to disperse. Ethan went to talk to his groomsmen. Leo stood up abruptly and left the church without a word. And Helen saw her chance. Julia was alone near the altar, adjusting one of the flower arrangements that had fallen. Helen approached slowly, her heart pounding. When she was close enough, she spoke softly so as not to startle the girl. "Julia?" She turned, her eyes red and swollen. Up close, Helen could see the exhaustion on her face, the marks of sleepless nights, the weight of a secret that was consuming her from within. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm sorry I didn't see you coming." "It's okay, dear. Are you all right?" The question was simple, but it carried immense weight. Julia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She seemed to be fighting an internal battle over what to say. "I am," she lied weakly. "It's just wedding jitters." Helen took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Julia, I need to talk to you, in private. It's important." Fear flashed across the girl's eyes like lightning. "I don't know if that's a good idea. Please, just a few minutes, it won't take long." Julia looked around, checking to see if Ethan was nearby. He was still engrossed with his friends on the other side of the church. She hesitated, but then nodded. "There's a room in the back where the planner keeps her supplies. We can go there." The two walked in silence through the church's corridors until they found a small back room, filled with stacked chairs and boxes of decorations. Julia closed the door and turned to Helen, her arms crossed defensively. "What did you want to talk to me about?" Helen took a deep breath. She knew she had to get straight to the point. "I know what's happening." Julia's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the accident. I know about the blackmail. I know that Ethan is forcing you to marry him." Julia staggered as if she'd been punched. She leaned against a stack of chairs, her legs seeming unable to support her weight any longer. How do you know?" "I found out, Julia. I have proof. Videos, messages, everything." Tears began to stream down the girl's face uncontrollably. She covered her face. With her hands and her whole body shook with the force of sobs held back for so long. Helen moved closer, and without asking permission, hugged her. Julia let herself be held, collapsing in a gesture of comfort she probably hadn't received in months. "I didn't know it was you," Julia sobbed. "I swear I didn't know. It was raining so hard I didn't see, and by the time I realized it was too late. I stopped the car, but I was in a panic. I'd had a glass of wine at lunch, and I thought if the police came, they'd think I was driving drunk. I panicked and fled. It was the worst thing I've ever done in my life. Every day I think about it. Every day I hate myself for doing it." "I know, dear. I know." "And then Ethan found out. I don't know how, but he had the videos, he had everything. He said he was going to report me, that he'd put me in jail, that he'd destroy my life. I was so scared. I don't have anyone else, my parents are gone, I just have an aunt who lives in the Midwest, and I barely talk to her. I was going to lose everything. And Leo," Julia cried even harder at the sound of his name. "I loved him, I love him, but Ethan said if I didn't break up with him and marry him, he would report the accident and destroy Leo too. He said he had ways to hurt him financially, to push him away from the family, to ruin his life. I couldn't do that to him. I'd rather suffer alone than see him suffer because of me. Do you understand that none of this is your fault? Do you understand that you're the victim of a cruel manipulation? But I committed the crime, Mrs. Anderson. I hit you and ran. I deserve to pay for it." Helen held Julia's face in her hands, forcing her to look into her eyes. "You made a mistake, yes, a serious one. But you were in a panic, you were scared, and you didn't leave anyone seriously injured. That doesn't justify what my son is doing to you. Blackmail is also a crime. Emotional manipulation is abuse. And I will not allow him to do to you what was done to me for years." Julia looked at Helen with a mixture of hope and fear. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to expose the truth. Tomorrow, during the wedding, in front of everyone." Julia's eyes widened in horror. "No! You can't do that. They'll arrest me. My life will be over." "Your life is already over, Julia. You're dead inside, living a nightmare, about to marry a man you don't love who is blackmailing you. That's not a life. It's a prison, and a much worse prison than any jail." "But, listen," Helen interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "I have all the proof. I can show the blackmail, the messages, everything. When the truth comes out, you won't be alone. You'll have a lawyer, you'll have support, and you'll be able to defend yourself properly. Yes, you'll have to answer for the accident, but with mitigating circumstances, with everything that happened, the punishment will be infinitely less than the emotional prison you're living in now. And more importantly, you will be free. You'll be able to go back to the man you truly love. You'll be able to rebuild your life for real." Julia was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "You would do that for me? Why? I hit you. Because I spent my life being manipulated, being controlled, being silenced, and now I have a chance to stop another woman from suffering the same fate. Because it's right. Because it's what needs to be done. And Leo? Will he forgive me? He loves you, Julia. Anyone who looks at him can see that. He will understand. It might take time, it might be hard, but he will understand. Just then, they heard footsteps approaching. Ethan was calling for Julia, his voice echoing through the halls. The two looked at each other, and Helen saw the panic in the girl's eyes. Take a deep breath. You just have to hold on for one more day. Tomorrow everything will change. Trust me. Julia nodded, quickly wiped her tears, and left the room. Helen waited a few seconds before leaving as well, giving them time so they wouldn't look suspicious. When she returned to the main nave of the church, she saw Ethan gripping Julia's arm with unnecessary force, whispering something in her ear. She was pale, nodding her head. Leo had returned and was watching the scene from her distance, his face grim. Helen walked over to where Ethan and Julia were. As she approached, she heard the end of Ethan's sentence. "And don't try anything stupid. You know what I'm capable of." He noticed Helen's presence and immediately let go of Julia's arm, forcing a fake smile. "Mom, I was looking for you." Julia got nervous with the rehearsal and was a little out of it. "It's a lot of pressure for a bride," Helen replied calmly, looking directly into her son's eyes. "All this weight of expectations of having to live up to something that isn't always true." Ethan frowned slightly, as if trying to decipher the double meaning of her words. "Yeah, well, but tomorrow will be perfect. Won't it, honey?" He looked at Julia, and there was a veiled threat in his gaze. She swallowed hard and nodded. "It will be perfect." Richard arrived at that moment, coming straight from a meeting. He greeted everyone with kisses on the cheek, talked about how beautiful the church was, how proud he was of his son. Brenda was with him, wearing a flashy red dress completely inappropriate for a church. She looked at Julia with barely concealed disdain. "I was imagining something grander for an Anderson wedding," she commented acidly. "But oh well, everyone gets married the way they can." The insult hung in the air. Julia looked down. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Helen spoke first. "Simplicity has its own beauty, Brenda. Not everything needs to be exaggerated to have value. Sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to the truth." Brenda stared at her, surprised by the response. Helen held her gaze, and for the first time in years it was Brenda who looked away first. The planner called everyone for final adjustments. Richard went to speak with the priest about something related to the ceremony. Leo said a quick goodbye, claiming he had work to finish, and left in a hurry. Helen noticed that he had barely been able to look at Julia, and that she hadn't been able to look at him. When everything was over and people started to leave, Helen saw Julia alone again, putting on her coat. She approached her one more time. "Julia?" The girl turned, her eyes still red. "Yes? Do you have someone to walk you into the church tomorrow to accompany you? To the altar?" Julia shook her head. "No, I'm walking in alone. It doesn't have to be that way. If you'd like, I can walk with you." Julia looked genuinely surprised. "You would do that?" "I would. And I'll be there, by your side, when the truth comes out. You won't be alone for a single moment, I promise." Tears streamed down Julia's face again. She hugged Helen tightly, and that hug held gratitude, relief, and hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." When they separated and Julia left the church, Helen was alone for a few moments. She looked at the altar, at the white flowers, at the space where tomorrow something no one expected would happen. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She knew she was about to destroy her family, but she also knew she was about to save it. She returned home in the late afternoon. The traffic was chaotic, typical of New York rush hour, but Helen barely noticed. Her mind was completely focused on the next day, mentally rehearsing every step she would take, every word she would say. When she arrived at the penthouse, she found Richard in his office on the phone. She walked straight past without greeting him. She went to her room, locked the door, and opened the black leather briefcase. She reviewed all the documents one more time, making sure everything was there, everything in order. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Leo. "I need you to be at the wedding tomorrow. I know it's hard, but it's important. Trust me." Leo took a few minutes to reply. "I don't know if I can, Mom." Helen typed, "You'll understand everything tomorrow. Please trust me, go." After a long silence, the reply came, "Okay." Helen put her phone away and lay down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling, thinking about everything she had been through to get to this point. She thought of the young woman she once was, full of dreams and expectations. She thought of how she had allowed those dreams to be slowly crushed, replaced by a resigned acceptance of a life that wasn't really hers. She thought of all the times Richard had humiliated her, and she had stayed silent. All the times Brenda had disrespected her, and she had just lowered her head. All the times she had accepted being less than she deserved because it seemed easier, safer, less frightening than fighting. But now, for the first time, she was going to fight. Not just for herself, though that was part of it, but for Julia, for Leo, for all the women who had ever been silenced and manipulated, for all the victims of men who use power and fear to control. She fell asleep late, and her dreams were a confusing mix of images. The altar, the flowers, Julia in her wedding dress, the leather briefcase, Leo's eyes full of pain. She woke, up several times during the night, her heart racing, her anxiety growing. When the sun finally rose on the day of the wedding, Helen had been awake for hours. She got up, showered, and dressed carefully. She chose a sober but elegant dress, a dark grey color. She made sure to look presentable, to appear firm and trustworthy. She needed people to take her seriously. She picked up the black leather briefcase and held it against her chest for a long moment. That object had become a symbol. The symbol of her courage, of her decision to no longer accept the unacceptable. She heard movement in the house. Richard was awake, Brenda too. Everyone was getting ready for the big event. The house had a strange energy, a mix of expectation and tension that seemed to fill every room. Helen left her room and found Richard in the hallway. He was impeccable in his expensive grey suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, the image of the successful developer. "Are you ready?" he asked, barely looking at her. "I am," Helen replied, "more ready than ever." He nodded distractedly and headed for the living room. Helen stood for a moment watching him. Go. She thought about how many years she had spent following that man, accepting his orders, molding herself to his expectations. But today would be different. Today she would follow no one. Today she would lead. They went down to the garage together. Richard drove in silence, Brenda in the passenger seat chattering about the guests who would be there, about the party after the ceremony, about how magnificent it would all be. Helen, in the back seat, held the leather briefcase on her lap and looked out the window, watching the city go by. New York was beautiful that Saturday morning. The sun was shining brightly, the sky a cloudless blue. A perfect day for a wedding. Or, Helen thought, a perfect day for the truth. When they arrived at the church, a crowd of guests was already there. Expensive cars parked, elegantly dressed people, photographers setting up equipment, security guards organizing the entrance. Everything very pompous, very exaggerated, very characteristic of the Anderson family. Helen got out of the car, holding the briefcase firmly. Richard and Brenda went ahead, greeting people, smiling for photos. She followed them at a safe distance, observing everything with a new perspective, the perspective of someone who finally saw the falsehood behind the masks. She entered the church, and the impact was immediate. The place was transformed. Thousands of white flowers decorated every corner. White satin ribbons hung from the pews. The altar was sumptuous. Everything screamed wealth, power, perfection. But Helen knew that beneath all that artificial beauty, there was only rot. She saw Ethan at a side entrance talking with his groomsman. He was elegant, smiling, confident. He didn't look like a man about to commit a heinous act. He just looked like a happy groom on his special day. She saw Leo on the other side of the church, alone sitting in a distant pew. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on nothing. Helen approached and sat down beside him. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I shouldn't be here, Mom. This is killing me." "I know, honey. But soon everything will make sense, I promise." Leo looked at her with that confused expression that was becoming common. "Mom, you're different. Ever since that day you came to my office. What's going on?" "You'll find out soon. Just promise me one thing." "What?" "No matter what happens in a little while, no matter what you see or hear, remember that everything I do is out of love. For you, for Julia, for all of us." Before Leo could answer, the music began. The guests stood up. The wedding was about to begin. And Helen, with the black leather briefcase held firmly in her hands, took a deep breath and prepared for the moment that would change everything. The sound of the organ filled every corner of St. Ignatius Loyola, echoing off the centuries-old walls with a solemnity that silenced even the most skeptical. The guests were all on their feet, turned toward the main entrance, awaiting the bride's arrival. Ethan waited at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, his face composed in the expression he had rehearsed in the mirror, that calculated mix of emotion and happiness that convinced those who didn't truly know him. Helen remained seated. She didn't rise like the others. She held the black leather briefcase on her lap, her fingers gripping the soft leather, feeling the weight of everything she carried inside. Beside her, Leo was standing, but his body was rigid, every muscle tense as if he were forcing himself to stay there against every instinct that screamed for him to run. The church doors opened slowly, theatrically, and Julia appeared. The wedding dress was stunning, all French lace, the train sweeping across the marble floor, the veil cascading like a waterfall of tulle over her shoulders. She was beautiful in a way that was heartbreaking, because that beauty was stained by the sadness her eyes couldn't hide. Julia began to walk alone down the center aisle. Her steps were slow, measured, but Helen noticed the hesitation in each movement, as if with every step she had to convince herself to take the next. The girl clutched her bouquet of white roses so tightly that her knuckles were white. When Julia passed the pew where Helen was sitting, their eyes met. It was only for a second, but in that brief instant, Helen saw it all. The fear, the desperation, the silent plea. Julia was asking to be saved, and Helen gave an almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise that she would not fail. Leo, beside Helen, let out a strangled sound, something between a sigh and a groan of pain. Helen took his hand and squeezed it hard, trying to transmit strength, trying to say without words that soon everything would make sense. Julia continued walking until she reached the altar. Ethan extended his hand to her, and when their fingers touched, Helen saw Julia flinch slightly. The priest, a man with graying hair and a deep voice, began the ceremony with the traditional words, speaking of the sacrament of matrimony, of love and commitment, of the union of two souls before God. Helen barely heard him. Her heart was beating so hard it felt as if everyone in the church could hear it. She knew she had to wait for the right moment. She couldn't be rash. It had to be at the exact time when the impact would be greatest, when there would be no way to ignore or suppress what she had to say. The priest continued, his monotonous voice following the script he had repeated hundreds of times. Ethan maintained that fixed smile, but Helen, who had known him since birth, could see the impatience in his eyes, the way his foot tapped lightly on the floor, eager for it to be over. Julia was as still as a statue, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the altar, as if she had mentally disconnected from the moment. The wedding party stood in a line beside the couple, all smiling, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. Richard, sitting in the front row next to Brenda, looked satisfied, like a king watching his empire expand. Brenda was busy waving discreetly to acquaintances, making sure everyone saw her in her expensive dress and gaudy jewelry. The priest reached the part about impediments. His voice rose slightly, following the age-old tradition. If anyone knows any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. It was as if time stood still. That second of silence that always follows the phrase at weddings. That moment when everyone breathes a sigh of relief, because no one is going to stand up, because it's just a formality, because that only happens in movies. But Helen stood up. The sound of her rising echoed in the silent church like a clap of thunder. Every head turned, hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on her. The priest stopped speaking, his mouth agape in surprise. Ethan instantly went pale. Julia let out a small gasp, something between relief and terror. Leo stared at his mother with wide eyes, and Helen began to walk. Her steps echoed on the marble, firm and determined. She held the black leather briefcase against her chest, like a shield, like a weapon, like the truth made manifest. Everyone was frozen. No one knew how to react. It was so unusual, so completely unexpected, that for a moment it seemed unreal. "Mom, what are you doing?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, shrill, with a poorly disguised note of panic. Helen didn't answer. She kept walking until she reached the altar. She stood facing everyone, the bride and groom, the shocked priest, the dumbfounded guests. She placed the briefcase on the liturgical table with care, and the sound of the leather meeting the wood was loud in the absolute silence. "Helen, what is the meaning of this?" Richard was on his feet now, his authoritarian voice trying to regain control. "Sit down, immediately." She faced him, and for the first time in 28 years of marriage, she did not lower her eyes. "I will not sit down, Richard, not this time. This time I will speak, and all of you will listen." "This is ridiculous." Brenda stood up too. "You're making a scene. Get out of here now." The priest, completely lost, tried to intervene. "My child, perhaps it would be better if we spoke in private." "No, Father," Helen interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "What I have to say must be said here now before all these witnesses, because this is about testimony, about truth, about what is really happening at this altar." She opened the leather briefcase slowly, almost ceremonially. The latches made a click that seemed deafening. She began to pull out documents, photographs, papers, spreading them across the liturgical table. The priest instinctively stepped back as if the papers were contaminated. Ethan took a step forward, his face red with anger. "Mom, stop this. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Ethan. For the first time in a long time, I know perfectly well." Helen picked up the first photo and held it up for everyone to see. It was an enlarged image of a red car's license plate. "This car," she began, her voice echoing through the church, "was involved in an accident 6 months ago in the East Village. A hit and run." Murmurs began to spread among the guests. People leaned toward one another, whispering, trying to understand what was happening. Ethan and Richard exchanged quick glances, and Helen saw panic begin to set in. "The person driving this car," Helen continued, picking up another document, "hit a pedestrian and fled the scene. The victim was taken to the hospital with a mild concussion and several bruises. She was kept overnight for observation." She paused, letting the information sink in. Then, with a deliberate movement, she pointed to herself. "I was that victim." The shock was palpable. Muffled exclamations echoed through the church. Julia covered her face with her hands, her bouquet falling to the floor. Leo rose from where he was sitting, completely lost, trying to process what he was hearing. "And do you know who was driving this car?" Helen turned to Julia, but her gaze was gentle, understanding, not accusatory. It was Julia, the bride. Julia collapsed. Her knees gave way, and she fell to the floor, sobbing, the full weight of months of secrecy and fear crashing down on her at once. Some guests screamed, others stood up, and confusion began to take over. "But wait!" Helen raised her voice, regaining their attention. "Wait, because the story doesn't end there. Julia made a serious mistake, yes. She fled the scene of an accident, and that was wrong. But you see, she was 25. She was in a panic, and she made a terrible choice in a moment of desperation. A choice for which she would have had to answer to the law." Helen picked up more documents. But she never got that chance, because someone found out what she had done. Someone obtained the security camera footage. Someone tracked her car to an auto body shop, where she tried to repair the damage and hide what had happened. "Ethan," the priest began, but Ethan cut him off with a shout. "This is crazy. My mother has lost her mind. Someone get her out of here." But no one moved. Everyone was mesmerized, captivated by the drama unfolding before their eyes. Helen took a flash drive from the briefcase. "On this flash drive," she said, are the complete videos of the accident. There are photos of Julia's car being repaired. There are receipts with fake names. And most importantly, there are screenshots of conversations. Conversations between my son Ethan and Julia. She began to read, her voice clear and steady. Ethan wrote, "You have two options. You agree to marry me and I make these videos disappear, or I turn everything over to the police and you face charges for a hit and run. You could even go to jail, your whole family will find out, and so will my brother." The silence was now absolute. Even the murmurs had ceased. Everyone in the church was paralyzed, processing what they had just heard. Leo, who had walked closer to the altar, was as white as a sheet. "My brother," he whispered. "What brother?" Helen looked at her eldest son with a mixture of love and pain. "You, Leo. Julia was being blackmailed to leave you, to end your relationship, and to marry Ethan, under threat, under duress. This marriage is not based on love. It is based on blackmail, manipulation, and psychological abuse." Leo staggered, needing to lean on one of the pews. He looked at Julia, who was still on the floor, crying convulsively, and then at Ethan, who was completely still, his face a mask of contained rage. "You," Leo said, his voice breaking. "You did this? You stole her from me with blackmail." "It's not like that," Ethan tried, but his voice failed him. Richard finally reached the altar, his face red with fury. "Helen, this has gone too far. You're going to ruin everything, destroy the family." "Destroy the family?" Helen turned to him, and there was a strength in her that no one had ever seen before. "This family was already destroyed, Richard. Destroyed by you. By your years of verbal abuse, of manipulation, of control. Destroyed by your schemes, your lies, your greed." She picked up more documents from the briefcase. "These are company contracts. Contracts you had Leo sign without him fully knowing what he was signing. Contracts that drastically reduce his stake in the company right after Ethan's wedding. All planned, all orchestrated to concentrate power in your hands and the hands of your favorite son." Leo took the papers from Helen's hands, his eyes scanning the pages, the realization and betrayal becoming evident on his face. You planned all of this. You tricked me. You used me." "Son," Richard began, but Leo cut him off. "Don't call me son, not after this," Helen continued, relentless. She knew she had. To reveal everything now, she couldn't stop. "And there's more. These documents show years of psychological abuse. Reports I wrote myself, recording every humiliation, every insult, every moment I was treated as less than nothing in this family. By you, Richard, and by you, Brenda." Brenda, who had been strangely quiet until then, finally spoke, but her voice was trembling. "You can't do this. You can't expose our private life like this." "Yes, I can. And I am. Because I will no longer be an accomplice. I will no longer pretend that everything is fine while lives are being destroyed. Julia's life was being destroyed. Leo's life was manipulated. And my own life has been a lie for almost 3 decades. The priest, trying to regain some control of the situation, raised his hands. "My children, perhaps we should all take a deep breath and—" "There will be no wedding, Father," Helen interrupted him gently. "This marriage is based on coercion, and it cannot proceed. Julia is here under blackmail. She is not here of her own free will." Julia, still on the floor, lifted her face. Her makeup was completely smeared, mascara running in black lines down her cheeks. But when she spoke, her voice had a clarity that surprised everyone. "It's true, everything she said is true. I never wanted to marry Ethan. I love Leo. I always have. But Ethan forced me. He said he would put me in jail, that he would ruin my life, that he would destroy Leo too. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, so I agreed, because it seemed like the only way to protect the people I love." Leo knelt beside her, his hands trembling as they reached for her face. "Julia, why didn't you tell me?" "Because he said he would destroy you too, and I couldn't let that happen. I preferred to suffer alone," Ethan finally exploded. "This is all a lie. She's being manipulated by my mother. Can't you see? My mother has always been unstable, always been fragile. She made this whole story up because she can't accept my happiness." Helen looked at her son and felt a deep sadness. She saw so much of Richard in him, so much of the cruelty, the manipulation, the lack of empathy. But she also saw the boy he once was before he was corrupted. "Ethan," she said calmly, "you can try to discredit my words. You can say I'm crazy, fragile, unstable. But you can't discredit the evidence. The videos, the messages, the documents. It's all here, and now it's available for everyone to see." She took several flash drives from the briefcase and began distributing them among the nearest guests. "See for yourselves. Judge for yourselves." Richard tried to intervene, tried to grab the flash drives, but people were already opening laptops and phones, plugging in the devices, starting to view the content. And as they watched, their expressions changed from confusion to shock to revulsion. One of the groomsmen, an older man Helen recognized as one of Richard's business partners, stood up and walked to the altar. He looked at Ethan with disdain. "Is this true? Did you really do this?" Ethan tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. His mask had completely fallen away. There was no more pretending, no more manipulating, no more controlling. "You're a monster," the man said, turning to leave. "I will no longer do business with people like you." Other guests began to stand up, some in shock, others visibly disturbed. The church began to empty slowly, people leaving in silence or in whispering groups. The perfect ceremony had turned into a public scandal. Brenda stood motionless, as if she couldn't process what was happening. Richard looked around with the expression of a man watching his empire crumble. Leo helped Julia to her feet. The two stood facing each other, years of love and pain between them. "Do you forgive me?" Julia asked, her voice breaking. "For everything?" Leo took her face in his hands, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the scene. "There's nothing to forgive. You were a victim, just as we were all his victims." He looked at Ethan with a mixture of anger and something that looked like pity. Ethan tried one last time to regain control. "You're all going to regret this, all of you. I have connections, I have power, I can—" "You have nothing," Helen said, her voice cutting through his rage. "Not anymore, because now everyone knows who you really are. The mask has fallen, and no amount of money, power, or manipulation can fix that." The priest, visibly shaken, closed his prayer book. "I don't think there will be a wedding today or any other day if these accusations are true." "They are true," Julia said firmly. "Everything is true." "Then may God have mercy on us all," the priest murmured, and exited through the side of the altar. The church was almost empty now. Only a few curious onlookers remained, watching from a distance. Helen picked up her briefcase, now lighter, emptied of its contents, but not of its fulfilled purpose. Julia approached her, still holding Leo's hand. "Mrs. Anderson, I don't know how to thank you. You saved me. You freed me." "No," Helen said gently. "You freed yourself the moment you decided to accept the truth. I just helped you make it public. But now I'll have to answer for the accident. I'll have to face the consequences." "You will, and I will be there as a witness. I will explain the circumstances, the mitigating factors. You won't be alone in this battle. None of us will." Leo hugged his mother, a tight embrace full of gratitude and love. "Thank you, Mum, for everything, for being brave when none of us could be." Helen held her son's face, tears finally streaming freely. "I should have done this years ago. I should have protected you, you and your brother, from this toxicity. But at least now, at least today, I managed to do the right thing." Richard and Ethan were isolated near the altar, Brenda between them, the three of them looking completely lost. Richard tried to approach Helen, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "No, don't come near me, not anymore. When we leave here, I'm going straight to a lawyer to file for divorce. I'm also going to the police with all the evidence of the blackmail. And I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." "You'll regret this," Richard snarled. "I'll take everything from you. You'll be left with nothing." "I already have nothing, Richard. You made sure of that for years, but now I have something you can never take from me. I have my dignity back. I have my voice, and I have the truth on my side." Ethan tried to approach Leo, but his brother backed away. "Don't touch me. You're not my brother anymore. Not after this." "Leo, No. There are no excuses, no explanations that can justify what you did. You destroyed the woman I love. You betrayed me. You blackmailed, lied and manipulated, and for what? For money, for power. Was it worth it? Ethan didn't answer. For the first time, he seemed to be at a loss for words, without arguments, without prepared lies. Helen gave one last look at the altar, at the white flowers that now seemed to be symbolically wilting, at the space that should have been a scene of love but had become a scene of raw, painful truth. "Let's go," she said to Leo and Julia. "Let's get out of here. You two have a lot to talk about, a lot to work through, and I have a new life to start." The three of them walked together down the center aisle, past the empty pews, the abandoned flowers, the promise of a wedding that would never happen. When they reached the doors, Helen stopped and looked back one last time. Richard was sitting in one of the front pews, his head in his hands. Brenda had disappeared, probably already planning how to save her own reputation. And Ethan was alone at the altar, a pathetic figure surrounded by the wreckage of his own schemes. Helen felt something then, that she hadn't expected to feel. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't joy in revenge. It was just a deep peace, the feeling of having finally done something that truly mattered, of having used her voice for something bigger than herself. They stepped out of the church into the bright New York sun. Outside, some guests were still talking in groups, processing what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Helen with respect, others with curiosity, others with judgment. She didn't care about any of their looks. Leo and Julia walked a few steps ahead, already lost in their own conversation, beginning the long process of healing and rebuilding. Helen watched them and smiled. At least there was hope for them. At least there was a chance for a true new beginning. She took out her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a divorce lawyer. The second was to the police station, scheduling an appointment to present the evidence of the blackmail. Then she took a deep breath of the city air, feeling lighter than she had in years. That morning had begun with the promise of a wedding. It had ended with the death of lies and the birth of truths. And Helen, the woman who for so long had been just a shadow, had finally found her light. The days that followed the wedding that never was were like a storm that finally clears, leaving behind both wreckage and clarity. Helen woke up the next morning in a hotel in Midtown, a simple but comfortable place she had booked the night before. For the first time in 28 years, she slept in a bed she didn't share with Richard, and that freedom, as terrifying as it was, tasted of rebirth. She checked her phone and saw dozens of messages, some from curious acquaintances, others from journalists wanting the story, but most were from people she never expected, women who had gone through similar situations, thanking her for her courage, saying she had inspired them to seek their own truths, former household staff saying they always knew she was strong inside and were rooting for her. Even some old friends, whom Helen had lost over the years of isolation imposed by Richard, reappeared to offer support. But the message that mattered most was from Leo. He wrote that he was with Julia, that they had talked all night, that there was much to resolve, but that they could finally do it together without lies, without manipulation, without fear. He ended by saying he loved his mother and was proud of her. Helen cried reading those words, not from sadness, but from relief, from gratitude, from a deep, genuine joy she hadn't felt in so long she had forgotten what it was like. She got up, took a long shower, dressed carefully, and left for her first appointment of the day. The divorce lawyer, Mr. Miller, had an elegant office near Central Park. He was a man, in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent gaze, and a solid reputation for not taking cases he didn't believe he could win. When Helen entered his office, he stood up and shook her hand firmly. "Mrs. Anderson, it's an honor to meet you. I must say, your case is all over the news today. The internet is buzzing with what happened yesterday." Helen sat down, trying to ignore the weight of that information. She knew there would be repercussions, but she wasn't fully prepared for the public dimension it would take. "I didn't do it for the fame, Mr. Miller. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And it was incredibly brave. Now let's work to ensure that bravery is legally protected. Tell me everything from the beginning," Helen told him. Every detail of her marriage, the verbal abuse, the psychological manipulation, the financial control, how Richard had isolated her from friends and family, how he had made her believe she was fragile. incapable, useless. And then she told him about Brenda, about Ethan, about her recent discoveries, about everything that led to that moment in the church. Mr. Miller listened attentively, taking notes, occasionally frowning in indignation. When Helen finished, he sighed heavily. "I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Anderson. This will be a complicated divorce. Richard has resources, expensive lawyers, and he will fight. But you have something much more powerful. You have the truth. You have documented proof, and you now have public opinion on your side. We're going to do this right. We're going to make sure you walk away from this with what you deserve and with your dignity intact. I don't want his money, Mr. Miller. I just want my freedom. You'll have both, trust me." From the lawyer's office, Helen went straight to the police station. She had an appointment with Detective Thompson, who was in charge of blackmail and extortion cases. Detective Thompson was a serious man with few smiles, but he showed genuine interest as Helen began to present the evidence. He examined the videos, the messages, the documents. He called in forensic experts to authenticate the material. He listened carefully to Helen's statement and made sure to record every detail with precision. "This is serious, Mrs. Anderson. Blackmail is a felony. Your son could face years in prison if convicted." Helen felt a pang in her heart. As much as Ethan had done, he was still her son. But she shook her head, pushing away the guilt that tried to creep in. "He needs to answer for his actions. I can no longer protect him from the consequences of his choices." "And the young woman, Julia, is she aware that she will also have to answer for the accident?" "She is. And she's willing to take responsibility. In fact, she's coming here tomorrow to turn herself in and give a formal statement." "That counts for a lot. The fact that she's coming in, voluntarily, that she's confessing. I'll recommend she be treated with all possible leniency. Still, there will be a process, possibly an alternative sentence, community service, a fine. But jail time is unlikely, considering the circumstances. I will be there to testify on her behalf, to explain the context, the coercion she suffered. Your presence as the victim of the hit-and-run defending the perpetrator will carry a lot of weight. That says a lot about your character, Mrs. Anderson." When she left the police station, Helen felt as if an even greater weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The wheels of justice were turning. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be fast, but it was happening. On her way back to the hotel, she stopped at a cafe in the West Village and ordered a cappuccino. She sat outside, watching people pass by, life happening around her. New York on a normal day, with its bustling streets, its crowded shops, its residents rushing from one place to another. She was a part of it again. She was no longer just a spectator in her own life. Her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Mrs. Anderson, it's Julia." "Julia, dear, how are you?" The voice on the other end was stronger than Helen had expected. There was still fragility, but there was also determination. "I'm okay. Better than I've been in months, actually. I'm with Leo. We talked a lot about everything. He understands, he forgives me, and we want to try again. Slowly, with therapy, rebuilding trust. But we want to try." Helen smiled, tears welling up in her eyes again. "That's wonderful, Julia. You both deserve that chance. And I wanted to thank you, not just for saving me yesterday, but for showing me what real courage is. You could have stayed quiet, you could have let it happen, but you didn't, and that changed everything. You would have done the same for me, I'm sure. I hope so. I hope I have half the strength you do." "You do, dear. You always have. You just needed someone to remind you." After she hung up, Helen stared at her phone for a long time. She thought about how life can change in a matter of days, how decisions we postpone for years can be made in seconds when we finally find our courage. The days turned into weeks. Helen rented a small apartment on the Upper West Side, a neighborhood she had always liked but could never live in because Richard thought it was too simple for their family's status. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. She furnished it slowly, buying pieces she liked, not ones that matched what was expected of her. The divorce proceedings moved forward. Richard tried every trick in the book, but Mr. Miller was his match. Every maneuver was blocked, every attempt at intimidation was recorded, and used against him. Public opinion, as the lawyer had predicted, was strongly on Helen's side. Stories from other women who had been victims of Richard over the years began to surface. Former employees, business partners, even social acquaintances, all with similar accounts of verbal abuse, manipulation, and control. Richard's public image completely crumbled. Contracts were cancelled, partners distanced themselves, the company began to suffer. And Brenda, realizing the ship was sinking, was one of the first to jump off. She took what she could and disappeared, returning to her hometown in upstate New York. Ethan was facing criminal charges. His lawyer tried to argue that the messages had been taken out of context, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But the evidence was too clear, too numerous. The judge denied bail after assessing the risk of witness intimidation. Ethan was forced to wear an ankle monitor and was forbidden from approaching Julia or Leo. Helen visited Ethan once. It was on a rainy day, 3 weeks after the cancelled wedding. He was living in a small apartment, a far cry from the luxurious penthouse where he had grown up. He seemed smaller, older, more broken. When he opened the door and saw his mother, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom." "Hi, Ethan." They sat in the small living room facing each other, and for a long moment, no one said anything. Then Ethan began to cry. Not manipulative tears, not tears to get something. Genuine tears from someone confronting the consequences of their actions. "I ruined everything," he said between sobs. "I lost my brother, I lost you, I lost my future, and I deserved all of it." Helen wanted to comfort him. It was her motherly instinct. But she knew he needed to feel this, needed to confront the reality of what he had done. "You made terrible choices, Ethan. You hurt people. You used fear and manipulation to get what you wanted." I know, and I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough. It doesn't undo what was done. It doesn't heal the pain you caused." "I know that too." Helen took a deep breath. "But I'm still your mother, and even with everything you've done, I still love you. I don't approve of your actions. I won't defend them or minimize them. You will have to answer for them, before the law and before yourself. But when you come out on the other side of this, if you truly change, if you truly grow and become a better person, I will be here, not to save you from the consequences, but to support your genuine transformation." Ethan cried even harder, and in those tears, Helen saw the possibility of redemption. It would be a long road, perhaps years, but it was possible. Julia turned herself into the police a week after the revelations. With her were Leo, Helen, and a specialized lawyer Mr. Miller had recommended. Her statement was given with full details, omitting nothing. Julia took full responsibility for the accident and for fleeing the scene. The district attorney, after reviewing all the evidence, including the proof of the blackmail she had suffered, offered a plea deal. Julia would be sentenced to 2 years of probation, with her sentence including community service at a public hospital. She would have to pay a fine and restitution to Helen, as well as attend a program on responsible driving. Her driver's license would be suspended for 6 months. It was fair. Julia accepted without hesitation, and when she left the courthouse after the sentencing, with Leo holding her hand and Helen by her side, she felt she was finally truly free. Helen used the restitution money for something she had been thinking about for weeks. With the help of Julia, who was a graphic designer, and with financial support from Leo, she founded a non-profit organization. They called it Free Voices, and its goal was to help women who were victims of psychological abuse, manipulation, and blackmail in relationships. The organization's physical space was in a renovated brownstone in the East Village. It had rooms for psychological counseling, volunteer lawyers for legal consultations, workshops on empowerment and self-esteem, and even a small, temporary shelter for women who needed to leave emergency situations. The opening took place 3 months after the wedding day. It was a simple but emotional event. Dozens of women attended, some whom Helen had helped personally, others who just wanted to meet the woman who had become a symbol of courage. Helen gave a short speech, her voice firm but full of emotion. "For 28 years of my life, I believed I had no voice, that my opinions didn't matter, that my feelings were exaggerated, that I was too weak to fight. and that belief almost destroyed me. It almost destroyed my family. But one day I realized that the only person who could silence me was myself, and on the day I decided to speak, everything changed. This space exists so that other women don't have to wait 28 years, so that they know right now that their voices matter, that they are strong, that they deserve respect, true love, and dignity. Welcome to Free Voices. This is a safe space, a space for rebuilding, a space of hope. The applause that followed echoed through the walls of the house, and Helen felt a deep satisfaction. She had turned her pain into purpose, her story into a tool for help, her broken silence into a chorus of other voices, finding courage. Leo and Julia were at the opening. They had officially gotten back together a month earlier, after many difficult conversations, many couples therapy sessions, much crying and much forgiveness. It wasn't easy, but they were both committed to making it work. And slowly, trust was being rebuilt. Julia had started working at Free Voices as a volunteer graphic designer, creating all the organization's visual materials. She also gave occasional talks about her experience with blackmail, about how to recognize signs of manipulation, about the importance of seeking help. She turned her trauma into a tool for education and prevention. Leo, for his part, had completely restructured his involvement in the family company. With the help of lawyers, he managed to reclaim his original stake and even increase it, as Ethan was being removed from all operations. Richard tried to maintain control, but the other partners, horrified by the revelations, forced a complete management overhaul. Leo took over as CEO, bringing a new philosophy to the development firm, one focused on ethics, transparency, and social responsibility. One of the first projects he approved was the construction of an affordable housing complex in the Bronx, something Richard would never have considered because it wasn't profitable enough. Leo proved that it was possible to do business ethically and still be successful. Richard, facing the loss of control in his company and the impending divorce, became a shadow of the arrogant man he once was. Helen saw him once, months after everything, at a divorce hearing. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of months. His hair was whiter, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lost. He tried to approach her during a break. Helen, Richard, I wanted to say that. He hesitated, the words clearly difficult. That I'm sorry. For everything. Helen looked at him for a long moment. She saw in him not the monster who had tormented her for decades, but just a broken old man confronting for the first time the consequences of his choices. I accept your apology, Richard, but it doesn't change anything. What's done cannot be undone. We can only move forward. You with your life, me with mine, finally separate as we always should have been. Are you happy now? The question took Helen by surprise. She thought for a moment before answering. Happy is perhaps too big a word right now, but I'm at peace. I'm free. I'm alive in a way I haven't been for years. And yes, that's a happiness of its own kind. Richard nodded slowly and walked away. It was the last conversation they ever had. The divorce was finalized 2 months later, with Helen receiving a fair share of the assets built during the marriage, including the apartment where she now lived and a sum that guaranteed her financial independence. 6 months. After the day that changed everything, Helen was on her apartment balcony drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning she had learned to appreciate. Her phone rang. It was Leo. Hi, Mom. Any plans for lunch? Nothing specific. Why? Julia and I wanted to invite you for lunch at our place. We have some news. Helen smiled. She loved when they invited her over. It had become a weekend tradition, these lunches where they talked about everything, laughed, made plans, and celebrated the second chance they had all been given. I'll be there at noon. When she arrived at Leo and Julia's apartment in the West Village, she was greeted with warm hugs. The table was set carefully with flowers in the center, the food smelling wonderful. During lunch, they talked about everyday things. Helen told them about a new case Free Voices was handling, a woman who had managed to leave an abusive relationship and was rebuilding her life. Leo talked about a project his company was doing to renovate a public school. Julia shared that she had landed a major new client for her freelance work, and then when they had finished eating, Leo and Julia exchanged glances. He took her hand and they both smiled at Helen. "Mum, we wanted to tell you something." Helen felt her heart speed up, a pleasant anticipation. "We're engaged," Julia said, her eyes sparkling. "Again, but this time for real, for love by free choice." She held out her hand, where a simple but beautiful ring shone. Helen felt the tears stream down her face before she even realized she was crying. "Oh, my dears, this is wonderful." She stood up and hugged them both at the same time, holding them tightly. "And this time," Leo continued, "it's going to be a small wedding. Just close friends and family, people who really matter. No excessive luxury, no masks, no falsehood, just love. And we'd like you to be our maid of honor," Julia added. "You're the one who truly brought us together, who made it possible for us to be here today. There's no one more important to us." Helen could barely speak through her emotions. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about plans, about the simple ceremony they envisioned, about the future they would build together. And Helen felt a fullness she never knew was possible. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a spring morning. It was in a small garden with only 20 people present. Julia wore a simple cream-colored dress with fresh flowers in her hair. Leo was elegant but relaxed in slacks and a white shirt. The officiant was a friend of the couple, not a priest, and the words were personal, meaningful, honest. When it was time for the rings, Leo held Julia's hands and spoke in a voice full of emotion. "Julia, we went through so much to get here. We faced lies, manipulation, pain, but in the end what prevailed was our love. And today, in front of the people we love most, I choose you. Not because I was forced, not because it's convenient, but because you are my person, my safe harbor, my future." Julia, with tears streaming down her face, responded, "Leo, you saved me without even knowing it. You loved me when I thought I didn't deserve to be loved. You forgave me when I doubted forgiveness was possible. And today, free from any pressure, from any fear, I choose you, for all that we are and all that we will be." They exchanged rings, they kissed, and everyone applauded. Helen, standing beside them as the maid of honor, had a face wet with happy tears. This was the wedding that should have happened from the beginning. This was true love. At the small party that followed, with live music and homemade food, Helen observed the people around her. True friends, supportive family, people celebrating not appearances, but substance. It was so different from that grand ceremony that had almost happened months ago. Leo found her during a quiet moment. "Mom, thank you for everything, for being brave when I couldn't be, for saving not just Julia but me too. You would have done the same, my son. I hope so, and I hope to teach my children, when I have them, about the courage you showed, about not accepting the unacceptable, about using your voice when everyone expects silence." Helen hugged her son, feeling an immense pride not just in him, but in herself, in everything she had accomplished, in all the lives she had changed, including her own. When the party ended and everyone had gone home, Helen stayed in the garden for a few minutes. She looked up at the sky, at the stars beginning to appear in the New York night. She thought about everything she had been through, about all the versions of herself that had existed over the years. The young dreamer who married Richard, the silenced wife who swallowed abuse for decades, the mother who watched her children grow up in a toxic environment, and finally, the woman who found her voice, who broke invisible but powerful chains, who turned pain into purpose. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Julia. "Helen, is everything okay?" "Everything is perfect, dear, absolutely perfect. You changed my life. You changed all of our lives. We changed each other. That's the power of women supporting each other, of voices joining together, of truth being spoken even when it's hard." Julia hugged Helen and they stood there for a moment, two women who had survived, who had fought, who had won. A year after the wedding that was interrupted, Helen was speaking at an event on women's empowerment. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of women present. She told her story, not omitting the painful details, not embellishing reality. She spoke about the 28 years of silence, about the day she decided to speak, about the consequences and the victories. When she finished, the ovation was long and emotional. Women approached her afterward, wanting to thank her, wanting to share their own stories. Helen listened to each one attentively, offered comfort, gave guidance on where to seek help. At the end of the event, a young woman, no more than 22, approached her. Her eyes were red from crying. "I'm in the same kind of relationship you were in. My boyfriend controls me, humiliates me, makes me feel small. And I thought I had to accept it because he says he loves me." Helen took the young woman's hands. "True love doesn't humiliate. It doesn't control. It doesn't diminish. You deserve more, and you have the strength to seek more, even if you don't know it yet. But I'm scared. Fear is normal. I was scared too. But you know what I discovered? On the other side of fear is freedom. There is peace. There is the possibility of being who you really are. And that is worth every second of courage you need to have." The young woman hugged Helen, and in that hug was everything the Free Voices organization represented. Hope, support, the promise that no one has to face it alone. Helen returned home that night feeling complete. Her small apartment, which she had decorated herself, which reflected her taste and personality, welcomed her like an embrace. She made some tea, sat on the balcony, and looked out at the city she loved so much. New York, with all its complexities, its challenges, its chaotic beauty. It had been a witness to her transformation. It had seen Helen Anderson, the silenced woman, become Helen Miller, her maiden name she took back after the divorce, the woman who found her voice and used it to echo for many others. The wedding that should have happened that day 15 months ago would have been a lie. It would have chained Julia to a life of unhappiness. It would have perpetuated a cycle of abuse and manipulation. It would have destroyed Leo. But it didn't happen, and in place of that lie, something much more precious grew. Truth, freedom, genuine love, second chances. Ethan was still under judicial supervision, doing community service as part of his sentence, attending mandatory therapy. Helen saw him occasionally, always maintaining healthy boundaries but never completely closing the door to the possibility of genuine redemption. It was a long road, and she didn't know if he would reach the end of it transformed, but she gave him the possibility. Richard had moved to the countryside, far from the spotlight of New York, living a much simpler and more discreet life. They had established a civil but distant relationship, speaking only when necessary about practical matters. The anger Helen had once felt had turned into indifference, and that was liberating in its own way. Helen picked up her journal, something she had started writing after everything happened. She wrote about her day, about the talk, about the young woman who asked for help, about how every small victory for another woman was also her victory. She ended the entry with a reflection. "Today marks exactly 15 months since I walked up to that altar. 15 months since I opened that black leather briefcase and changed the course of so many lives. Sometimes I still wake up at night wondering if I did the right thing, if I could have done it differently. But then I remember the look in Julia's eyes when she realized she was free. I remember Leo's hug when he understood the truth. I remember every woman who thanked me for finding courage in my story to find her own. And I know that, yes, I did the right thing. Not the easy way, not without pain, not without consequences, but the right thing. And if I could go back in time, I would do it all over again." She closed the journal and looked at the framed photo on her nightstand. It was from Leo and Julia's wedding, the three of them embracing with genuine smiles, their eyes shining with happiness. That photo represented everything she had fought for: true love, freedom, truth. And as the city of New York slept outside, Helen Miller, at 54, finally found something she had been searching for her whole life without knowing it: peace. The peace of someone who had lived, made mistakes, learned, fought, and won. The peace of someone who had turned silence into voice, weakness into strength, victim into survivor into victor. Tomorrow would be another day, with new challenges, new women to help, new battles, to fight. But today, in this moment, she simply existed. And that was more than enough. It was everything. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen, Leo, and Julia has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by Helen's courage in breaking decades of silence and transforming her pain into strength, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most in this journey of liberation. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and celebrate the courage of those who choose the truth, even when silence seems easier. We'll see you in the next episode with more stories that will make you reflect, feel, and believe in the power of transformation.